Before anyone drew a graph or wrote an equation, one man watched empires crumble and saw the pattern everyone else missed. Wealth doesn't climb forever, power doesn't last, and success quietly plants the seeds of its own destruction. And what he discovered in the 14th century explains why your economy, your market, your entire financial system is following the exact same path right now. His name was Ibn-Khaldun, a North African thinker born in 1332 into absolute chaos. Dynasties rising and falling like tides, cities flourishing one decade and abandoned the next, plague tearing through populations, power shifting between rulers so fast you could barely track who was in charge, and this wasn't some peaceful academic environment. This was his laboratory. Because Ibn Khaldun wasn't theorizing from a tower, he was in the courts, advising rulers, watching them mismanage wealth, overtax their people, lose everything, and act shocked when it all fell apart. What he noticed will make your skin crawl. The same story kept repeating, different names, different places, same arc. Discipline becomes comfort, comfort becomes decadence, decadence becomes decline. And here's the part that matters to you right now. He understood something most people still don't get. Economies aren't machines. They're living organisms that run on trust, cohesion, shared belief. And when those weaken, no amount of money saves you. Ibn Khaldun called this force Asabiyyah, which loosely means social cohesion, but economically it's far deeper. It's trust, it's incentives, it's people willing to cooperate and build something bigger than themselves. And when societies had strong cohesion, they became productive and resilient even with limited resources, because groups that trusted each other worked harder, defended their systems, enforced norms that supported stability, and wealth followed naturally. Not because they started rich, but because their structure allowed productivity to flourish. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Success changed everything. As wealth piled up, elites drifted away from the productive base that created it, rulers became insulated, bureaucracies expanded, positions became inherited instead of earned, the discipline that built the system softened, comfort replaced necessity, cohesion weakened. And this wasn't him judging people for getting lazy. This was him describing incentives. Because when survival isn't urgent anymore, behavior shifts, risk tolerance drops, innovation slows, extraction becomes easier than creation, and the state starts living off past success instead of present productivity. Look at what he saw with taxation. Early in a state's life, taxes were low. People worked and traded willingly because rewards outweighed burdens. Economic activity expanded, revenue grew. But as the state matured, rulers increased taxes to support growing courts, armies, administrative layers, and at first revenue still rose, but eventually higher taxes discouraged production. People worked less, trade shrank, the tax base eroded, and the response was predictable. To maintain revenue, they raised taxes again and again, each increase accelerating the decline. The state wasn't starving because it taxed too little. It was starving because it taxed too much of a shrinking economy. Ibn Khaldun described diminishing returns centuries before the term existed, and what makes this devastating is its neutrality. He didn't say low taxes are good and high taxes are evil. He said incentives matter. When people believe effort gets punished rather than rewarded, they disengage. When capital gets extracted faster than it can regenerate, the system weakens. States don't collapse because they lack authority. They collapse because they exhaust the source of their own strength. He extended this to government spending and corruption. As states aged, rulers grew accustomed to luxury, court life expanded, public funds got diverted to preserve status instead of productivity, bureaucracies multiplied, positions were sold or inherited, and corruption didn't start as criminal intent. It started as normalization. Everyone adjusted to the new standard. The system didn't feel broken. It felt entitled. And that entitlement had consequences because spending rose faster than output, taxation increased to compensate, coercion expanded to enforce compliance, trust eroded, and as cohesion weakened, enforcement became more expensive and less effective. The state spent more to get less, trapped in a cycle of its own making. Replace dynasties with institutions, replace courtiers with bureaucracies, replace caravans with supply chains. The logic stays intact because Ibn Khaldun wasn't describing medieval peculiarities. He was describing universal behavior under power and prosperity. And his most important insight is this: markets reflect people before they reflect numbers. Prices move because confidence moves. Productivity rises because incentives align. Decline begins not with collapse, but with subtle shifts in behavior. Less trust, more extraction, weaker cohesion. If Ibn Khaldun looked at today's world, he wouldn't be impressed by technology or distracted by market complexity. He'd look past the screens and focus on what he always focused on: incentives, cohesion, power. And what he'd see would feel painfully familiar because modern economies believe they've escaped history. We talk about progress like it's permanent. Each generation assumes it finally solved instability with better data, better policy, better institutions. But Ibn Khaldun's core insight cuts through that optimism. The cycle doesn't disappear when systems advance, it accelerates. Social cohesion today shows up as trust in institutions, confidence in currencies, belief in rules, willingness to cooperate in impersonal systems. And when those are strong, economies grow, people invest, risk feels manageable, long-term planning makes sense. But when they weaken, everything becomes transactional, short-term thinking dominates, extraction replaces contribution, and you can see this in boom periods. Early in expansion, growth feels productive, new businesses form, innovation spreads, returns tie to real output, but over time, success changes behavior. Capital concentrates, barriers rise, financial engineering outperforms real production. Wealth becomes less about creating value and more about positioning within the system. This is the modern version of Ibn-Khaldun's elites drifting from the productive base. Governments face the same pressures as economies grow, states expand with them, programs multiply, administrative layers thicken, expectations rise. None of this is malicious, it's structural. Prosperity creates demands that only prosperity can temporarily sustain. But when growth slows, commitments remain, revenue becomes harder to generate, the temptation to extract intensifies. And this is where taxation, debt, monetary policy intersect, because modern states don't just tax, they borrow, they inflate, they defer costs into the future, but Ibn Khaldun's logic still applies. When the burden of maintaining the system outweighs perceived benefits of participation, cohesion erodes, people disengage economically, politically, psychologically, trust weakens, compliance becomes fragile. Debt functions like delayed taxation, allowing states to preserve living standards and institutional scale without immediately confronting declining productivity, and for a while, it works. Confidence holds, markets absorb issuance, growth appears stable, but the underlying dynamic hasn't changed. The system is still consuming future output to support present structures, and eventually, the arithmetic becomes unavoidable. Ibn Khaldun would recognize this instantly. It's the phase where complexity outpaces coordination, where maintaining appearances becomes more important than maintaining foundations, where leaders mistake temporary stability for permanent strength. This isn't collapse, it's pre-collapse, the stage where systems feel most confident and most vulnerable simultaneously. What makes this cycle persistent is that it doesn't rely on bad intentions. It relies on normal behavior under success. Individuals respond to incentives, institutions protect themselves, elites rationalize extraction. Each step feels justified in isolation. It's only when viewed as a whole that the pattern becomes obvious. And modern financial markets amplify this because asset prices rise faster than wages. Speculation outpaces production. Financial assets detach from underlying value, creating the illusion of wealth without cohesion to sustain it. And when corrections come, they don't just reset prices, they test belief. Who trusts the system? Who expects protection? Who bears the cost? Because Ibn Khaldun understood legitimacy matters more than force. States can compel compliance temporarily, but cannot compel productivity indefinitely. When people no longer believe the system works for them, participation declines, innovation slows, risk-taking collapses. The economy contracts not because resources disappear, but because cooperation does. Economic cycles feel brutal because they aren't just financial adjustments. They're social realignments, power shifts, old structures weaken, new groups emerge with stronger cohesion and discipline. The cycle resets not because history wants balance, but because incentives demand it. And importantly, Ibn Khaldun never promised escape. He didn't believe wisdom could freeze systems in their prime. His insight was more unsettling. Decline isn't a failure of intelligence, it's a consequence of success. The same forces that build wealth eventually undermine the conditions that made it possible. So what does this mean for you? Ibn Khaldun wasn't writing personal finance advice, but his framework offers something more valuable. Perspective, understanding cycles doesn't make you immune, but it changes how you interpret them. You stop mistaking peaks for permanence. You stop confusing scale with stability. You recognize when incentives are shifting, even if prices haven't followed yet. And this is where real financial freedom begins. Not with perfect timing or prediction, but with humility. With understanding that systems are temporary, confidence is fragile, cohesion is more valuable than any asset class. You don't need to outrun the cycle. You need to stop being surprised by it. Ibn Khaldun's genius wasn't predicting the future. It was stripping the future of its mystery by anchoring economics in human behavior. He made cycles visible, and once something is visible, it loses its power to shock, because history doesn't repeat because people are foolish. It repeats because incentives remain stubbornly consistent. And Ibn Khaldun saw that clearly long before modern economics gave cycles, names, charts, equations. His work reminds us that beneath every market, every state, every financial system lies the same fragile foundation: trust. When trust holds, prosperity follows. When it fractures, decline begins quietly long before anyone notices. And that's the pattern playing out right in front of you today. If you like these videos, subscribe for more.